Hello and welcome to another video from the Tradelands Nation. This is our annual readout of the state of the game of Tradelands. And like we always do, we will start with a look at the in-game economy. At the final closing bell of the year, the M&G index closed the month at 25,185, and this is up 5.5% after shaking off a potential downward streak occurring at the beginning of December, right before the release of the holiday event. The JSI index ends at 19,586, a gain of 1 2/3% or 322 points. However, the index did show a loss of momentum at the end of the month, likely due to the release of premium woods, and unfortunately, that means the JSI index did not close the year above 20k like we had predicted back in November. Finally, the earnings index closes at 43,347, up a very strong 10% for the month. It's a strong finish that follows up on the momentum that it was gaining in November, meaning that it was the first time all year that we saw two back-to-back months for the earnings index with gains on the stock market. If we look at the performance of the economy over the entire year, we do get a slightly different picture, however. For the year, the M&G index ends up 6.26% from where it started. While this is a positive finish, it was a very rocky year for miners. About midway through the year, the market for mineable materials saw a steep and steady decline, with the timber felling industry making a competitive run to outpace it for the first time in history. But a surge in onyx demand and the announcement of changes to the mining system that will be coming in 2025 had a largely corrective effect on this. One thing's for certain, if you do enjoy the current method of mining, our advice is to mine as much as you can while it exists the way it does today, because it's not guaranteed that it will work this way for much longer. Timber felling, on the other hand, which is measured by the JSI index, had an incredible run this year, gaining 11.85% over the course of the year. The index even reached a peak of 22,500 in June of 2024, a move which almost allowed timber felling to outpace mining as the top resource profession in Tradelands. And even though it wasn't able to maintain that momentum, timber felling is definitely posed for success in 2025, assuming the late month dip doesn't continue to weaken the profession further. And finally, the earnings index, which miraculously ended up gaining 3.75% despite a near collapse in the fourth quarter. The turmoil in the last quarter of the year was due to a prominent trade group being investigated by the SEC before finally declaring bankruptcy before the end of the year. The convenient timing of two holiday events provided some much needed momentum to correct this, and ultimately brought the index back up into positive territory to finish the year. And when you put all of this together, it means that the economy of Tradelands grew by 6.69% in 2024. And going a bit deeper, let's look at some of the specific winners and losers this year. And we will first take a look at the losers. Brass, ice, and katanas all saw their price drop this year. And all three saw that drop due to their rarity being impacted by crate releases. Katanas used to be one of the most difficult items to purchase under 90,000 doubloons. Their re-release this year in the Nautilus crates has significantly reduced this category's overall value. Although some sellers do still try and differentiate OG and new gen variants of the katanas, really they are pretty much the same. Brass previously had no easy in-game method of being obtained, so this really had no impact to most players, but ice, which was once only obtainable by taking a loss in crafting an electro-steel pickaxe, has seen its value permanently brought down to around half of where it was prior to 2024. Meaning that it's not even worth trying to obtain ice through the in-game methods anymore, because electrosteel is far more valuable than ice. On the winner's side, the biggest one is advanced engines. The release of new and very successful ironclads this year has upped the value of these by around 50,000 doubloons, and this is likely a permanent fix in these prices, unless there is no new ironclads added in 2025. The other winners were Ebony, also benefiting from a successful release of new ships this year, and Onyx, which saw a price bounce due to a resurgence in maple interest, which is earned through the use of an onyx pickaxe. All of these things show that adding new ships to the game in 2024 have led to a positive market change across the board. And getting more to the point, we now look at our 3 market predictors for guidance on what to expect in 2025. First, oak and iron, which are predictor materials because of their high drop rates and thus high trade volumes by other players. Iron prices have gone from an average of 157 per piece at the start of the year to an average of 179 per piece, and a price increase of 21 points or 12%. Oak has gone from 146 per piece to 152 per piece, a change of 3.77%. which means it's relatively unchanged, or what we would call trending flat. Premium tokens are the third predictor, which are the base material for items made or purchased with the use of premium tokens, of course. Starting the year at 242 per piece, it ends at 248 per piece, a change of 2.48%, which is again fairly flat, despite all of the heavy swings up and down that occur during the holiday and crate events. And those 3 predictors are an important metric and a good segue into our next topic, because throughout the year, numerous players have complained about inflation of items in-game. And the reality is, this is not accurate, especially when we look at the numbers. Inflation, in the consumer's context that we are familiar with, often refers to how much higher a price of an item is to the natural growth of a market. In Tradelands, the market grew by 6.69% in 2024, and 2 of these 3 indices are below that number, an indication that the alleged inflation of prices are likely due to the natural year-over-year increase in value that occurs to rare items that are often sought after by veteran players and those on the upper end of the economic spectrum. These upward prices will feel like inflation to them, but in reality it is a consequence of aging of an in-demand item. Similar example would be an antique in real life, where the value of that item increases over time, but also the demand for that item dramatically decreases as well. And while we only showed a couple of items on screen today, if you are curious to know how other items perform throughout the year, a link in the description of this video will show you the full year's worth of price changes, as well as a green bar showing the suggested high and low prices for the year. You can also use our price guide if you want to see how those items are performing at present. And with the economics out of the way, the next big item to talk about is the first in a series of anticipated changes to Tradelands, and that is the addition of a new faction called the Trade Guild. It is no secret that I am a huge fan of this faction. I've been advocating for a way for players to play the game without having to step into the PvP world of Tradelands for several years now, because I primarily enjoy the player-based economy that this game has, that is robust enough to actually simulate real-world economics, and it's amazing that this faction took so long to introduce to the game. On the surface, the Trade Guild faction is specifically for traders who want to just trade cargo without the hassle of constantly looking over their shoulder for Hallenguard or Blackwind players. It's a perfect way for new players to acclimate themselves to the game. After all, if your first experience playing Tradelands was not a good experience, you're not likely to stick around long enough to actually learn to play the game and ultimately become a part of the PvP community. And while cargo trading on a ship is clearly the focus of this faction, there are other benefits that make this an excellent choice even for experienced players. Chief among them is the fact that if you're a shop owner, joining this faction when you have your shop open means that PvPers from an enemy faction can't just enter your house and try to kill you while you're making trades. The same goes for mining and timber felling, which, you know what, I'll just say it, if you're grinding for something in this game for even like holiday vouchers, then PvP isn't really what you're here for, and it's already hard enough to do the grind without that additional distraction. So joining the Trade Guild allows you to focus on that task that you logged on to do, and leaves PvP to occur where and when it is right for you. But in my opinion, the biggest benefit of all that this faction brings to the game is that it makes sense to do all of these activities on high population servers. For years now, the developer of the game has been trying to entice players to play only on high population servers, but for many of us, we still choose to pick small unpopulated servers because the risks involved in playing on a high population server significantly outweighed the rewards, especially for solo traders. But now they don't. And we recommend that all traders try to play the game on the largest server on the Trade Guild and not continue their runs on smaller servers, because the immersion of a world that is living and breathing around you is an incredibly different experience than the very isolating experience trading on a small server provides. Even though it has numerous benefits, there are also some downsides to the Trade Guild. If you are a new player, the first one that you're most likely to discover is that this faction is not entirely free of PvP. The most obvious place where this occurs is in the Eastern Sea, but when you go there, you will get a notification that tells you you're entering a PvP zone and allows you time to actually turn around while you're still protected. So this one's fine in our opinion, but what's more important is that there are hidden PvP zones throughout the Grand Isles. That's the main map of Tradelands, and you are not notified when you enter one of these zones. And one of the first ones, if you're a new player, that you're likely to encounter is the one that's at Cannoneer's Key, because there's a trader there and it's also a lucrative mining spot. And it will surprise you when it hits you for the first time, because you wouldn't have known it was a PvP zone otherwise. The problem is that experienced players do know that this is a PvP zone, and they also will know how to snipe you off your ship while you're pulling in to the harbor. I have experience with this, so I know it's happening. So if it does happen to you, my advice to you is when you respawn, click the respawn on your ship when you get the notification, and just work very quickly to turn your ship around as fast as possible, or if you have cargo to sell it and turn around. You will probably die a few times, but if you're not max level, they won't get anything from this other than to just convince you not to go mining on Cannoneer's Key, which is usually what these miners are doing. And that's just Cannoneer's Key, and there are other zones that you need to be careful around, and you'll start questioning them as you pull into port, but that's probably the first one that you will encounter. The other downsides will come as you start leveling up. You will encounter them mostly during max level. Effectively, you cannot spawn ships on the Trade Guild that are above level 9. And that means the Beaver will most likely be one of the best trade ships that you can use until you decide to switch factions. Blueprints and exclusive ships also work though, making these even more valuable to a Trade Guild player than they would any other faction, which is a good thing given their economic focus. The other thing is that you cannot gain any global experience points past level 9, but you can gain faction points, and this is the game trying to push you into moving into a PvP faction once you are ready to hit max level, and level 10 is probably the right time to try these for the first time. And to conclude, it's a great faction to play if your sole reason for playing Tradelands is to play the economy of this game and not so much the PvP side of things. And the community has largely given some static to people who are like this, so if you are that player and you are experiencing this static from the rest of the community, know that at least I plan on playing this faction a lot. So you will have at least one supporter on your side. And my long-term hope is that these current restrictions holding down the Trade Guild faction will slowly but surely begin to lift as the other PvP factions get their turn at an upgrade, which has already been announced by the development team that's in the works. After all, this faction will be played by players who really enjoy the very unique economic system the players and the developers have crafted in this game of Tradelands. And to borrow from the game's very description, the Trade Guild offers you the opportunity to embark on your own epic journey through the Grand Isles and to become one of its wealthiest merchants. But while we have discussed what the Trade Guild is, we haven't discussed why it exists. And for that, we now turn to the politics of Tradelands. When the war with Pershovia ended after a peace agreement between the infamous leaders Admiral Spirit and King Little Noob, Nova-Whitecrest was left with the perception that it was nothing more than a rump state following their complete defeat earlier in 2024. The newly minted Grand Sea Lord Tatsu sought to change that perception and began building an invasion fleet under the guise of amassing a fleet that would end their dependence on Whitecrest ships. However, King Little Noob's informants warned him of this buildup, and he preemptively attacked the ships that were stationed at Perth, wiping out months' worth of construction efforts. In retaliation for this, Nova-Whitecrest would launch a counterattack with all of its forces on the fortress of St. Christopher. Here, the Whitecrest soldiers made a stand against these attackers. Admiral Repriles, the famed commander who had defended the fort from the recent Pershovian invasion, mounted its defense, and as the Novan soldiers made their way closer to the island, the words of another stalwart defender could be heard echoing over the waves. It was none other than the White Knight himself, the Paladin of Whitecrest, Sir Reynold Barristan, and together these two would successfully mount the defense of St. Christopher. Wave after wave of Novan soldiers fell to the Whitecrest guns. Nova would lose thousands of troops in futile charges over and over against the fortress, and days of losses would turn into weeks, and weeks of losses would turn into months. It is said that Nova knew they were defeated when the Whitecrest mortar team successfully disabled Nova's only artillery ship, dooming Nova to a slow death outside of the fortress walls. Captain Reprisals would allow his soldiers to pick off any Novan soldier that strayed too close to his fortress. Until finally, realizing that Tatsu might actually be bringing Nova to the brink of another total defeat, he decided that he had to lead the final charge of the Novan soldiers personally. Tatsu reformed the disorganized Novan troops on the island into waves, where one wave would assault the fortress, with the other waves applying suppressing fire. One at a time, they would enter the fortress. This tactic forced the Whitecrest defenders to keep their heads down until the soldiers were able to breach into the interior of the fort. The strategy worked. Sir Ranald desperately defended the courtyard, but his contingent was overwhelmed. Despite this, the cannons at the rear of the fortress were still controlled by Whitecrest throughout the battle, and they were ordered to fire on the Novan mortar ship that Tatsu had brought with him from Nova Balreska. But this time, while Whitecrest was able to repeat their precision targeting with effect, the fortress was already in a state of chaos, and the loss of their mortar ship did not matter. That chaos inside the fortress was what Tatsu quickly exploited, and in the confusion, he was able to corral the Whitecrest defenders into pockets and eliminate them one by one. And finally, after taking so many losses, the fortress was finally taken. An important victory for Nova, as it gave them a launching point to make their way into the heartland of Whitecrest itself. For their part, the retreating forces of Whitecrest would mount a counterattack to try and retake the fort, but this was inevitably unsuccessful. They chose instead to pull the remainder of their forces back, rather than commit to the same mistake that Nova had made in making repeated futile assaults. And this would ultimately lead to the blockade of Whitecrest, and it was here that King Little Noob made his fateful choice, for it was tradition that a besieged force attempts to blockade run during a siege in order to continue existing as a trading faction. But Whitecrest was well provisioned and well supplied, and would be capable of outlasting any blockade near indefinitely. Moreover, Birkeland had sent word that it was planning to assist Whitecrest in its defense, so there was no reason for King Little Noob to act rashly. So the king instead ordered his trade fleet to remain anchored in the harbor, and this is when Nova Balreska realized its fatal mistake. Whitecrest traders represent over 80% of all traders in Tradelands. The most important trade route in the entirety of the Grand Isles is the Triangle Trade Route, and when the blockade happened and Little Noob would not give Nova the benefit of attempting to capture its blockade runners, trade along this route completely collapsed, leading to a parley between the three great powers of the Grand Isles, because without the Triangle Trade Route, the entire region was now on the verge of a complete and total economic collapse. After all, two of the ports on this route belong to Whitecrest. Coupled with the fact that trade is almost exclusively conducted by Whitecrest traders, it stands to reason that Whitecrest stood to lose a lot if this trade route stopped running. But Nova Balreska controls Salem, the third leg of this route. It is an important transfer hub for trade goods in the Grand Isles, and the bulk of Nova's economy is earned through revenues and tariffs that come into Salem, as it is one of the key ports of call for all trade that goes to the Western Sea, which is also where Nova dominates the trade lanes. And with no cargo coming into Salem, Nova stood to lose just as much, if not more, than Whitecrest when this trade was shut down. Blackwind was in the worst position of all. Harrisburg and Fort Verner are the transfer hubs for trade with Birkeland, which are the two most lucrative hunting grounds for pirates based in Blackwind Cove. Now, with no new trade going to Birkeland, pirate crews were forced to use their personal wealth in order to keep the faction afloat, something that these factions that were built solely on the accumulation of wealth did not want, and so the parley was formed, and it was agreed that no matter the political turmoil that may exist between the various factions of Tradelands, the trade must always flow. And it was agreed that Whitecrest's trade fleet would forever forward be able to operate under a flag of neutrality, with trade representatives from all factions forming a committee of leadership, and thus the Trade Guild was born. And shortly after this, needing a respite from the war that almost ended all of Tradelands, Tatsu and Little Noob agreed to a peace. But the world that came out of the aftermath was forever changed. Nassau had defaulted on all of its debts when the trade to the island stopped. The people of Nassau blamed holiday tickets for stealing their revenues, but Whitecrest, realizing that it was just bad judgment on several of their native merchants that actually caused the issue, forced Nassau to pay off their debts before they would be allowed to return to the kingdom of Whitecrest. They would form the Republic of Nassau, and excited at the idea of a republic where you can vote, they immediately voted to become a complete dictatorship under one man called It's Nasty. And at this news, the rest of the Grand Isles, who saw this inevitability coming miles away, they simply rolled their eyes and derided this new faction of Tradelands as It's Nasty Derwickers, to be left to their own devices. And it will be up to the people of Nassau if they will rise above this derision or succumb to it. And in the north, the funding challenges of Blackwind left Halengard to fend for itself, where these new and largely untested natives gained their own form of independence, and it's still relatively unknown what they plan to do, but one thing is certain, the world of Tradelands has changed irrevocably. And in the last hours, Nassau was seen drawing up papers to make its first official declaration of war as a new country, in the hope of attaining greatness. And the faction they chose to go to war against was Nova-Whitecrest. Now the question is this the beginning of a journey that will make all of the Grand Isles bask in the golden sunlight cast from atop their lighthouse in Nassau? Or is it actually the moment when Nova-Whitecrest will teach them what it means to go up against a real navy? That is a story that has not yet concluded, however, and perhaps a good place to stop our report for the month. So thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in-game.